Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is May 25th, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'm Professor Hamamoto, and I would like to welcome to the live stream ECAT, Corky Goss, Robert Kovacs, Piper Vogel, and Infidel Apostate, and any number. Oh, Tyrone, huh? How you doing? Welcome to this talk here that's going to be on it's not clickbait. I'm going to get to Perry Hilton, or as we know her, Paris Hilton. But today the theme is a continuation of some research that I've been doing, inspired by my readings of the author Steve Hodel, who, as most of you know by now, was a career Los Angeles Police Department detective, and he claims that his father, medical doctor by training, George Hill Hodel Jr., was the person who is commonly known as the so-called Black Dahlia Killer. In a more recent book, I don't have a copy of it right here, but I read it over the weekend. It's called Evil, Pure Evil? I can't remember the exact title. Evil's in the title, and it's a more recent one. And here he makes the claim that his father not only was the Black Dahlia Killer, but he was also the Zodiac Killer. Now, I have some acquaintance, with both cases, but I've read extensively on the Zodiac Killer years ago, and the person who's most associated with the foundational books on the so-called Zodiac Killer is an author by the name of Robert Greystone, I think his name is. Let me see if I have it correctly here. Don't want to give you the bad information. Oh, Robert Gray Smith. All right. I know you'll correct me in the comments, and I welcome that. But I don't often refer to my notes here. So and a lot of this is from memory. But I will tell you that I have an extensive background beyond the true crime genre. That is, my approach to understanding society and culture, specifically American culture, U.S. culture. One of the angles of approach is this through its sexuality, sexual behavior, sexual ideologies, whether it's manifested in film, literature, and behavior, now new media, or new sites, dating applications, like, whatever they might be. They're constantly proliferating, right? That's the nature of the sexual enterprise, I suppose. It's a never-ending source of investigation, because so far sexuality hasn't been outlawed, or it hasn't been eliminated, but that could be changing if the AI robot people have anything to say about it. So I look at sexuality, but I also look at crime, specifically true crime. Yes, I read crime fiction, but I look at it more specifically through the lens of the sociologist, the anthropologist, through the true crime genre. And that's what, there's a distinction. There's fiction, and it's drawn from books like this. And then there are the more repertorial nonfiction, although both of them require literary and narrative skills, and both of them are not completely objective. And that's why it requires you and me to bring our critical intelligence and our observations, our own experience, into the process. It's interactive. That's what's so important about reading in particular. It's interactive in that it forces your own critical consciousness to come to the forefront, rather than electronic media, which mostly washes over you and through you. It leaves its baleful influences on you, but it really doesn't it's so immersive, as the term goes, that it doesn't really allow you to critically act on what you are perceiving, what you are experiencing. And that, to me, is one of the major differences between text and electronic media. So I look at true crime, and I've been doing this for a number of years. I'm reminded of this when I was preparing for this talk. I had a essay published in a 2003 anthology. That's quite a long time ago now. Not that long, but long enough for me to gain more perspective. And I haven't really change from my working hypothesis, and that is that you want to understand a society and a culture, its history, look at its crimes, look at its true crimes, not just the common ones, the everyday street crimes, not just the sensational ones like the Black Dahlia murder, but we have to define criminality uh, in a much larger perspective. Let's say institutions such as the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institutes of Health, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, various medical schools, medical faculties, and the people who were in there. Maybe they are participating in crime on such a routine basis that we can't even identify it. And that's why I am talking about Black Dahlia. Yeah, it's inherently interesting and important, but I'm doing this because I'm trying to understand the contemporary forms, the contemporary expressions of criminal behavior and the mentality and the ideology and how these perpetrators operate. And I will do this today, I get into a little bit of motivations, but I'm not so much interested in that as the outcomes. So to give you an example, and I can mention his name now because his star seems to be setting finally. It was only a matter of time. You know, he was being set up for this all along, and he might have known it. This is why he kept putting himself out there instead of running away. No one was going to be defending him, so he had to defend himself the best he could. And I'm speaking of Dr. Anthony Fauci. So anyway, we'll get to people such as that in a moment. But to finish up this thread of my own genesis, my own progress through this exciting as well as I think important topic of true crime, this anthology, edited by my friend and colleague, comes out of UC Berkeley Political Science, which year in and year out, it's always one of the top 3 in the U.S. of political science departments, Carl E. Boggs, and the academic essay of mine that I contributed, and he accepted as the editor. And that's why I mentioned his name. Most political science editors would just scoff at what I had to say, but he's been very supportive of my work through the years. And he's one of those people who, in spite of having intense, elite, high-level academic training and experience, is broad-minded enough, open enough to accept unorthodox approaches to common problems. So thank you very much, Professor Boggs. And the title is Empire of Death and the Plague of Civic Violence. So let me just read you a little bit of some of the reviews. And this book's available on Amazon. It's really expensive now. When I got it, it was published by a trade publisher. Now I guess it's an academic book. It's like something like $70. So go to your library and try to find it. It says this excellent collection of articles on the crucial question of U.S. militarism, its impact abroad and within the U.S. itself. See, and that's an important point because Dr. George Hodel, while most of his crimes were perpetrated, and I happen to subscribe to most of the arguments and the evidence that his son Steve Hodel presents to us over a range of 4 or 5 volumes. Even though most of those crimes were committed here in the U.S., he did have extensive overseas experience. In fact, the last half of his life was spent partly in Hawaii and the state of Hawaii, and a little bit of time in the Philippines, quite a bit actually, where there was a crime, not incidentally, that was very similar to in pattern and modus operandus that was going on here in the U.S. So Steve Hodel thinks that some of the crimes that were showing up in Metro Manila bear the hallmarks of his own father, Dr. George Hodel. And then later he moved to Japan and he became a big expert on all things Asian. And especially so far as marketing, he became the expert on marketing. And I mention that is because as I've alluded to earlier, marketing and advertising, not only they sell us junk food, right? Cereals, box cereals. I mean, not the real cereals like a buckwheat, and, grains and whatnot. But I mean the packaged, processed foods. But they also provide garbage for the mind so far as ideas, perversions, deviations, in the guise of avant-garde, perhaps, like in the case of the surrealist art movement that Dr. Hodel was involved with through his big buddy. And this was a real find for me, that he was involved with people like Salvador Dali, not just involved, but he knew them personally, and which made me, it forced me to rethink my fascination with that whole school of so-called art, and it also forced me to push back the timeline on the degree to which state level and religious institutions were involved in perverting the public consciousness, the mind, the society, and culture via the arts, the fine arts. So anyway, this little blurb here connects this two seemingly disparate areas: overseas, foreign, and the domestic. And my argument in the essay that I contributed, right, Empire of Death, is that a lot of the crimes that we see here today in the latter or the early part of the 21st century are very much related to the American imperial project, starting with the Philippines and then the wars through the Pacific War, right, in Japan. And it's no coincidence, by the way, that Dr. Steve Hodel, once he left the US, married a succession of Asian women, first Filipinas, and then his last wife was a Japanese national, because that's part of the colonial process. You go overseas, you're like Tony Bourdain, you like the cuisine, but you also like the women. Or if you're into guys, you're into the little boys there. But that's part of the payoff that you get as a colonial representative, whether it's Great Britain or the US or whatever country. And I guess the same holds true for other groups. There are probably Chinese today, overseas Chinese, who are in the US or in Canada. In fact, there's one that I found out recently. His name is Pan, Qiuqing Pan, who had American, Anglo, quote unquote, white women who were his mistresses or girlfriends, right? So that's part of the colonial power expression, right? Through sex, political power, economic power, philosophical power, geostrategic power is embodied and extended through sexuality. And in the extreme end of it, it's expressed through sex crimes, including lust murder, as it was called in Weimar Germany, Lustmord, or as we call it, sex murder, right, in the true crime genre. Okay, so let me move from my background and my interest and my own contribution so far, bringing it up to date into 2021. My contribution is expanding the understanding, the notion of what Dr. George Hodel represents. He's not just a psychopath. He's just not a psycho killer. These are just trivial labels. This is the extent to which 99% of your YouTubers, that's as far as they'll go. They'll describe the information and we're all fascinated. We think we know something about it, but there's no attempt, because they can't, the people who are reporting on this do not have the background or even let alone the wherewithal or even the comprehension that there's deeper meanings underlying these heinous crimes. And that's where I come in. And this is where I resent being categorized with Brent Assclown over at Portland State, or I forgot, I shut his name out, or these other people, or Robert Seifer, whose credentials I don't even know. And that's the last time I'm going to rant about these people. But I have to do this at the outset of these talks, because some of you are new and some of you think you know everything there is to understand about the so-called Black Dahlia Killer. And some of you think you know everything there is to know about the so-called Zodiac. Wrong. You might know the particulars just as I do, but I'm going to bring something new to this this analysis, just like most of you probably thought. Not just you, I mean, not people here in the chat room, you know better than that, but the people are just kind of touring through here, think they know everything about Paris Hilton, and they know everything about Tony Bo, who I refer to as we know him better as Anthony Bourdain. I refer to him as Tony Bo. That's my my pet name for him. That's just an example of how this type of analysis will reveal a whole nother world of intrigue. And again, it relates to the imperial control of not just the Anglo-American power bloc, but also the French imperial bloc, who were involved with drug dealing on a global level. The French connection. You saw the movie. The Marseille connection, and that there were the assassins from Marseille who were present at the JFK assassination in Dallas, right? That whole connection there, and they work very closely with U.S. intelligence as well. So we see someone like Tony Bowe connected that through his father, who was of that background. See where I'm going with this? This is why these true crime is too important to be left in the hands of the wankers, right? The YouTubers and the people on TNT and the people on the Hitler channel. Today it's called the History Channel. When they first came out, it was Hitler, 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 Hitler. But now they branched out in true crime, and all the people on iTunes. I'm going to eat your lunch. I'm jumping into the true crime genre, and you're going to be astounded by the depth of analysis that you're going to have to compete with. And I'm not just saying that because I'm going to drive you out. I want you to up your game. I want you to present your information and your analysis beyond just simply being a bunch of violent porno. I'm very cognizant of the fact that this type of material is so sensationalistic that's all you're feeding. You're just feeding, just like the people who are involved supposedly against fighting the New World Order. All they're doing is perpetrating fear, and they're race baiting. The China this, the Chinese, or even President Trump got into that China. It's the China virus, right? And that's really at a really dopey simian. Not even adolescent. Most contemporary adolescents have more respect for China and that part of the world than people who are older, because they're growing up in new realities. All the cool stuff comes from East Asia, so far as the popular culture is concerned. In fact, Paris Hilton herself, in the extended version of her documentary, which I'll talk about in a moment, she credits her fans in Japan for her career. They're the ones who really made Paris Hilton, who, by the way, is also part of a psyop that she doesn't realize yet. And Japan and South Korea as well is the psyop central in Asia, and that's another reason why Dr. George Hodel probably set up shop in Tokyo, because it's a socio-cultural as well as genetic, radiological workstation. Outpost for this larger New World Order, for lack of a better phrase, a New World Order system. Okay, so we're going to reject the psychopath, the labeling, the pathology, just sort of the trivial stuff. We're going to reject, and we're going to keep the information, the forensic information, but we're not going to be content with what Robert Graysmith tells us about the Zodiac. It goes much deeper than that. He says, he made a lot of, Graysmith made a lot about the fact that the so-called Zodiac Killer, who had the outfit, and I'll let you watch that yourself. That's what YouTube's good for, just to get yourself up to speed so far as the Zodiac Killers and back in the 70s, late 70s. But he says, well, he was just sort of pissed off that he wasn't getting girlfriends or whatever, and he was just a frustrated military guy. All these sort of psychobabble type of, he doesn't really delve too deeply into the babble part, but just sort of the psychologization of something that's materially related to historical power relations between agencies within the U.S., amongst the American people, and mostly between different countries, foreign powers. So I say, the psycho killer was targeting young lovers, and he did. 3 or 4 of them were couples who were necking out in the Lake Berryessa area, which is not far from me. And so he just assumes that he had some sort of masculinity problems, or whatever area. If you're like in the gender studies, you're going to say, well, he was probably a latent queer, so he had to kill everybody that was in the heterosexual, on and on and on. We all kind of operate on our assumptions and our biases, including myself, but I try to control for them always. This is what research, that's what science is about, always reflecting on your presuppositions here. Okay, before I go on, I do have to mention two books that are very, very important to my progress since 2003 when I wrote that book on, I'm sorry, the essay, Empire Death. One of them, and I will recommend them for purchase. I just checked on Bezos.com. They're available there. They're still for sale. So pick them up if you want to go further in this. Well, I won't guarantee, but I'm pretty sure that you will not be disappointed. If this talk is of any interest at all, you want to read these two books, one by David M. Silvey, Silvey. The title is Project Artichoke. Subtitle, Zodiac was cover for silencing witnesses from the RFK assassination, published in 2010, self-published, by the way. So this really started to reframe how I understood, because I used to think that these were one-offs. It was just one person who had a certain obsession, whatever it might be. He was pissed off at young lovers. I was kind of like, I accepted Graysmith. I knew there was more there, but I didn't have any idea. But Silvey is saying that this operation that Graysmith places in a certain context, a limited one, is really not so much about the killing itself, as awful and as heinous and horrendous it is, and awful as it was for the families of the survivors and for the dead, not to mention, right? Or respectfully, the people who were victimized by this. But it was more to obscure another crime, and in this case, it's the RFK assassination. Now, I don't know if I completely buy his explanation, his connection to the RFK assassination, but what his contribution to my progress is that yeah, these crimes are probably what I call today nested crimes, right? Which, like the matryoshka, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing it, the Russian nesting dolls. There's a crime within a crime within a crime, and this, Edgar Allan Poe and some of these detective fiction people have talked about that phenomenon of creating a crime to obscure a larger one. So that itself is not a new idea that I came up with, but it is not a novel way of understanding the serial killer and the mass murder. I'll give you another example. I alluded to it last week on the Thursday Trio. I stated that Elliot Rodger was not about being a 20-something-year-old virgin, 21, 22. They called them incels, right? Involuntary celibates. That's how it was portrayed out there. It sounds good, and it also helps label these people who are being shut out because of the sexual revolution or whatever it might be. But I claim that was the real crime, was him going in on a female secret society called Delta Delta Delta. I'm sorry, this was on the Reality OS show with Tracy Connors and Peter Duke. We had a brief discussion. I mean, we covered a lot of topics. So that's where I kind of introduced this notion of nested crimes. And Elliot Rodger fills that pattern. And I also was able to introduce the notion that there are female secret societies. Well, it's almost up till now been understood or presumed to be strictly a male phenomenon. But I'm saying that their secret female societies are embedded in college, university, sororities. In this case, it was Delta, Delta, Delta. And Delta is about mind control. So you have Tri-Delta. Whoa, that's a tell right there. And oh, by the way, I'll also share with you this in passing, that female secret societies and political empowerment was also being exerted through the spiritualist movement of the late 19th century, right? With spirit photography. Andy Besant comes out of that, by the way, the Theosophists, the people who brought Madame Helena Blavatsky into the public consciousness. Those people were the females. It was part of a female political movement. So if you look at it from that perspective, you can understand Annie Besant and other less known women who I'm starting to read their fiction as well, including this one woman named Gilman, Gim. I think I forgot her first name, Gilman, Gilman. Oxford Literary Press Publishers has a book of her. Leonie Gilman, that's her name. Yeah, she's one of these early secret female society members that I think is a really, really good opportunity for those of you who are listening right now. Start digging into American Female Secret Society, because we really need to find out about that. They've been getting away with a lot for far too long, and it's it'll be a major contribution, and I will contribute to that in my own limited capacity. So check out David Sylvie. It's kind of a roughly written book. It's self-published, and I have an ex-friend or a former colleague, I don't know how you want to describe her, I've lost touch with her, who claims to have helped Sylvie write the book, smooth it out. If she helped, she didn't do a very good job. But the point is there, even though if you can overlook some of the roughness of the narrative. Now, a really good book on all counts, and I might read you some of the table of contents if I have time at the end of this talk. But the second book that I would recommend that you purchase, a little more expensive, it's $25. I think it's worth it to you. It's by and I'm telling you this because these can disappear at any moment. Robert Duncan. Its title is Project Soul Catcher. Project Soul Catcher, Volume 2, also published in 2010. And this is where he gets into the most state-of-the-art techniques and tools and strategies that high-level elites are using in order to control the masses as well as segments within, including professionals, which I'll talk about in a moment. So when you're talking about George Hodel, he died a number of years ago, and his peak area of operation was for the 50s and 60s and 70s. That's quite a long time ago. And the techniques and the tools have been much more refined over that time. So Robert Duncan will bring you up to speed into showing where these types of techniques picked up where I believe Dr. George Hodel left off, because he was a first generation soul catcher, if you want to call him that. I'm talking about George Hodel. So check out Robert Duncan. Okay. Some of you may have difficulty in wrapping your mind around the idea that a medical doctor who's probably took the Hippocratic Oath, which is again shrouded in secret initiation, right? The caduceus itself with the intertwined snake on a staff. I mean, stop right there. I mean, you're talking about initiation. But some of you may not fully accept the idea that a medical professional, medical doctor, an MD, because we hold them in such great reverence, right, could ever engage in such activity. Well, let me give you a contemporary, a current example. This is as recent as 2017 or so. Of course, his actions go further back, but by the time it was reported, the Los Angeles Times did a really good job on reporting this guy at great risk to its own reporters. And I noticed they had 4 or 5 or 6 bylines, people on the byline, because they didn't want to have just one author exposing such an extensive and thoroughgoing level of corruption at the University of California, Southern California, University of Southern Cal, USC, otherwise Trojans, right? And this was the reported activity, and he was convicted, and I think he's in prison now. I don't know if he's still around. He'd be good to interview, wouldn't he? But his name's Dr. MD, doctor, not PhD, Carmen A. Pugliafito. Carmen A. Pugliafito. He was the dean of the medical school at USC. It's called the Keck, K-E-C-K, Keck School of Medicine, USC. And the title of the article is An Overdose, a young companion, female, Drug-Fueled Parties, subtitled The Secret Life of a USC Med School Dean. I'll let you find that article, right? So, but I'm just trying to give you an example that Dr. Hodel, it's on a continuum. He's at the extreme end of the deviance continuum, if you want to call it that. Carmine Pugliafito, MD, I don't know if he's been stripped of his medical license. I hope so. Is on that end of the continuum as well. And then there are the people in the middle who are just doing their job. And then there are some at the other end of the spectrum who are not even practicing at all, probably because they decided that the system is so corrupt, they're better off outside it altogether. So there you go. Another example before I continue and conclude is this is a little bit further back. This is a guy around my age. His name is Joseph Michael Swango. I don't know if there's been a book written about. I think there was because I knew about him. I think I read a book about Joseph. Dr. Swango. He was an MD, medical doctor. SWANGO, Swango or Swango. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. He has a bunch of aliases as well. Of course, he had a nickname given to him by the press. He was called Dr. Death. And he is self-admitted serial killer. He admits to only 4. When I say only 4, he admits to 4 serial killings, by poisoning, but he is suspected as being responsible for as many as 60 fatal poisonings of patients and colleagues, right? And most of you, all of you in the chat room here in the live stream are perceptive to enough to probably thinking, gee, there sounds like there's this guy running around free who is high in the American medical establishment who's responsible for killing far more than 60 people through poison. And I won't mention his name and I won't mention the poison. I'll let you have the fun and games of guessing who I'm thinking about, right? So there's Dr. Swango. Check him out. And the third, just to show you, and I might do a whole presentation on this topic alone. I think it's worthwhile. This is not just clickbait. I watched, based on a Patreon discussion we had last month, and there's one coming up soon, by the way, for those of you, and welcome, by the way, all the new patrons. You're making it possible for me to do this type of work, to buy these expensive books, and to subscribe to all the different software services like not StreamYard, but Zoom and whatnot, so I can do this type of work. Thank you very much. But in that Patreon discussion last month, someone talked about these boys' homes where they were abducted. They're probably teenagers, I imagine. That tends to be when both boys and girls start to act up and can run away and do some damage. So I assume they were teenagers, but they were abducted out of their own homes in the middle of the night and taken away. And that stuck with me. And sure enough, when I watched this documentary titled This Is Paris 2020, year 2020, last year, probably late last year, I think. I'm only now getting to it, but and there's an extended version, which I also watched. If you're a YouTube Premium, is it called, or you're a subscriber, and that Patreon, you're helping me subscribe it, then you get the extended version as well. I recommend watching the documentary, and overcome your prejudices about Paris Hilton, whatever you think about her, because truthfully, I wanted to watch it and I wanted to not like it, and I wanted to not like her for what she represents and what she's done to the culture, especially for young girls. And she admits it. She says, yeah. So the director, whoever it was interviewing, said, do you feel any responsibility for this sort of self-absorbed selfie culture and the self-perception twisted of young girls? She said, yes, I do. So you admit it, Perry Hilton. You can make good on it, but you're not going to do that by simply perpetuating a form of bondage that I saw on this video here. I don't think I have time. If I do, I'll show it. Where you're going to testify in front of a legislative body, but you're all masked up and everybody in there is masked up. Do you not realize that you were traumatized as a teenager, and now you're trying to expose the extent of these so-called social emotional learning centers. They're more like abductee concentration camp for rich people. Do you not realize, Miss Perry Hilton, that you are perpetuating and even enabling an even larger form of abuse and bondage, not just for privileged kids like yourself, but for the American public by playing along with the charade there. That's my major critique of this is Paris and how she is now refiguring herself because she knows it's coming to an her handlers know that the celebrity culture is coming to an end or opting out of it. Major professional sports, MLB, and football in particular, and all that stuff. It's going down. Hollywood, we're going away from. So Perry Hilton's handlers, and she does have handlers. She's smart, she's brilliant in her own right, but she's part of a larger psyop. Most of you, you know, don't need any persuasion from coming from me to figure that one out. They know it's so she's getting ahead of it, right? And she's currying pity for people who've been through these social emotional learning, and she has it. She has it because these places are awful. And I'm developing some literature now. I'm gathering literature. And by the way, this the Harvard School, Graduate School of Education, because a lot of this stuff, these problems we're seeing are coming out of graduate schools of education, not just at Harvard GSE, but Berkeley, Columbia's one, UCLA, all of them are run by these mind wizards, right? I'm not going to call it mind control because that's become a cliche by now for YouTubers, right? I'm going to go with Robert Duncan character. I'll call them soul catchers, right? Remember the novel about soul catching early on that was done by a psyops expert by the name of Jerry Salinger. We know him in the literary world by his name, J.D. Salinger, right? Catcher in the Rye, right? Catcher in the Rye. That's about this form of love abuse, social emotional learning that the Harvard, they even have an initial SEL. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you're of that economic bracket where you can afford to send your kids there, congratulations. But I'm not telling you what to do. I would think twice about it, and I would also think twice about camps in general. I think a better idea would be for you yourself as parents or grandparents, relatives, go with your children yourself. Get dirty and be out. You can do glam. It's called glamping. You can camp in relative luxury if you want to. I think that's a better model than just sending your kids off to be abducted. And that's what happened to her. These two thugs came in the middle of the night to her home, and it turns out both of her parents, who by all appearances seem to be caring and loving parents, but they think that they can just pay for any type of professional services, including straightening out her behavior problems, right? All they have to do is take her cell phone away and say, no, you can't be out till 4 o'clock in the morning. You're only 16 years old, and stop smoking. And we're going to cut off your account over at Saks Fifth Avenue or wherever Paris Hilton likes to shop, right? But no, they sent her off to this social emotional learning, and I'm not blaming Paris Hilton for that. I don't think really her parents. I'm blaming this system of Paris Hilton calls it the troubled teen industry. That's a good one, troubled teen, and it is an industry. And guess what? It's run by so-called mental health experts, who to me are anathema, because they took over the university. They took over my job. They pushed it out. They pushed me out of my office. They locked me out of my office, and they brought in a Asian American female, Vietnamese American, whose father was probably a psyops dude. They brought her in there, who is a Ph.D. in counseling psychology, to manipulate through social emotional learning all the undergraduates that I otherwise was teaching and instructing. So that's another layer of analysis that I bring to it because I was in the belly of the beast and I saw what was happening, and I can understand the fear. And 20 years after the fact, she still has these nights. She can't even sleep at night. She needs her blankie to sleep, even if she's at home, let alone traveling around the world. And she calls it post Ph.D. She's suffering from trauma, and she's not alone. She brings together some people who went through this particular school. They tried to shut it down, and they didn't do it. Why? Because I think it's integrated into a larger system, just like Penn State. You're not going to shut down because the state itself, the empire of death, operates on feeding on souls. You could be wealthy and privileged and quote unquote entitled, like Perry Hilton, or you could be someone who lives in dire straits outside Metro Manila. It doesn't matter. You're all part of the grist for this mill where the soul is ground up and reconstituted and served up to you packaged at like Pringles or instant soups, whatever it might be. So this is Paris, recommended viewing. I think I decided I'm going to go into that one a little bit more deeply at a talk in the future. I just couldn't help but drawing the comparisons between what Perry Hilton went through and what Dr. George Hodel was involved with. Because, by the way, I also found an article about him playing the role of a mental health professional, even though he was a surgeon by training. He was a medical doctor. He got his surgical training at University of California, San Francisco. Right, did his pre-med at Berkeley. He went through the UC system, in other words. But then went to Hawaii. I think he got maybe a MA degree or got in behavioral science. And I found an article about him and how to test people who are worthy or qualified from a psychology perspective, qualified to go to seminary school, and also predicting their success, right? He wrote an article about it, and he himself is a product of this type of intelligence testing. He was one of the part of Terman's termites, as they were called, up at Stanford, right? You've heard of the Stanford-Binet test. Well, Dr. Hodel went through that. That's when they realized, hey, we got something here. Let's groom this kid. Let's train him from the start. And then we will have a person who can further train other soul-caught children, because that was his job. This is something that Steve Hodel, the author, does not get at. This is my contribution. George Hodel's primary role was the training of a whole new generation of cadre of assassins, of heartless victimizers, stalkers, completely amoral social actors. That was his main job. And in order to train them, he had to expose them to the most ultimate heinous types of human behavior possible. I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm running out of time here, like usual. Okay, let me get right to the chase here. If nothing else, I want to leave you with an important original insight about Dr. George Hodel that his son Steve Hodel hints at, but can never fully admit to himself. Maybe he's not aware of it. Maybe it's a matter of avoidance behavior, as they say in the therapeutic setting. It's probably it's just beyond his imagination, is beyond his ken, like most people, including people who are practitioners, right? People who are professionals in the psychoanalytic field. All right. Hodel, the author, talks about his father, his precociousness in areas of sexuality and sexual expression. He attributes to the fact that as a 16-year-old genius level precocious engineering student at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, he impregnated the wife, the much older than him wife of a faculty at Caltech. And it was such a scandal. This is in the late. This was before World War II. It was such a scandal that she had to leave the area. We're talking about Pasadena, which is outside of LA, and she had to go to the East Coast. And he followed her over there as a teenager. He wanted to marry this woman, and he wanted to be the father to the daughter. And she sent him back home, and he felt rejected. And supposedly that set him on this decades-long run of hate and misogyny towards women. That's a little bit too easy and convenient for my liking. What this tells me, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that he impregnated a woman, she was 16 years old, and she was much older than that. Most 16-year-olds are quite intimidated by other 16-year-old girls, and they're certainly going to be intimidated by a fully grown woman who's, let's say, 25 in her late 20s, or in her 30s. I don't know how old this woman was. She was much older than him, but she was the childbearing. Most people would never be brought into that. So either he was brought in, and maybe he was, in order to blackmail or compromise his faculty member, and also disrupt their marriage by impregnating her. But it also connotes, implies that young George Hodel had previous sexual experience, and I think it was coming. Wait for it. This previous sexual experience was coming from his mother, Esther Hodel. Remember, I mentioned that she comes from this sort of Sabbatean Frankist background, a certain region where Jacob Frank and the Sabbateans had a lot of followers, and a lot of that migrated to the U.S. Later on. And I think his grandparents, Steve Hodel's grandparents, were of that background. And his mother, Esther, who was a dentist, by the way, in the days when medical profession, it was very rare for a woman to be a dentist. She was professionally well accomplished, and she was in Paris, which is a hotbed of occultism, even to this very day. With the current president of France, Emmanuel Macron, comes from that milieu. He's definitely been sexual traumatized in the way that George Hodel, young George Hodel, probably was. Because if you know the background of President Emmanuel Macron, he married his teacher from school. She's significantly older, and I'm not trying to be sexist by saying, yeah, she's too old, but she was his teacher back in school. That's the president of France. So there's a scant material, research material that's published on this. Like I told you, that even this idea of mother-son incest, even within the profession, is not well recognized. It's so horrific and so counterintuitive that even people who look at abnormal psychology or deviance, I mean, that's their job. They write about it. They have patience. They analyze people. Even these people are loath to go in that direction. Professor Hamamoto, though, I have to go where the evidence and where my gut instincts and my experience goes. Personal, I'm not that I'm a product of this type of relationship, but in speaking to people who have a very close experience, let's leave it at that, with this type of deviance, and I will assess a blanket statement. It's deviant, and it's anathema, it's immoral, and all of it. And I have to say that because there are some people out there who are in academia, by the way, who want to throw off all the bans into intergenerational sex, right? That's where they're starting, right? First, they destroyed the gender distinctions, and then now they're trying to get the children involved. And then it'll be sex between mother and son, and father and daughter, anybody. And we're also seeing some signs of bestiality, interspecies sexual. As bizarre as that sounds, there's a whole subculture called furries, furry culture, furry fandom, that is part of this reengineering of sexuality problem. So George Hodel, later to become Dr. George Hodel, I would argue, was a victim of this is from an article by Howard S. Rudelminer, Consummated Mother-Son Incest in Latency, a case report of adult analysis. Let me just read you very quickly the abstract. And for the Patreon people, thank you very much. I'm going to post this after this talk today so you can read it, because I don't want to read this live. It's so horrific. I mean, this guy, to his credit, and I'm glad that he wrote this down in a report, but it's for specialists. There might be a child watching this, and I don't want them to to read this. That's why I'm putting it on Patreon, not so that I can, earn an extra buck, but it's a sort of a filter for people who shouldn't be reading this type of material. But for those of you who want to, and I'm telling you in the Patreon, if you are really sensitive to it, or you might have had some firsthand experience with this type of deal, think twice about reading it. I'm just giving you the warning here. But anyway, here's the abstract. Reported cases of mother-son incest are very rare in the psychoanalytic literature. The fact of such incest, however, may not be so rare as has been generally believed. A detailed case report of the analysis of an adult with a history of severe physical, sexual, and verbal abuse, including consummated incest with his mother during latency, is considered in the context of other reported studies. The author raises some issues of resistance and counter-transference. I'm trying to read this as fast as I can, that may influence the reporting, treatment, and perhaps even recognition of cases of mother-son incest. And you know what he says resistance on his own part? He's writing about his own patient, and he put the case study together, gathered all the literature, and he was going to publish the results. But he, quote unquote, accidentally lost his notes, and only 13 years later did he find them misfiled in his cabinet way in the back. So he thinks self-analytically that he was so really repulsed by his findings that he refused to, he purposely lost this case study. Only now, many years later, is he getting around to it. So this essay is really interesting on many, many levels. I have a whole bibliography, however. I'm not going to go through it because I'm running out of time. Mother and son incest, its long-term consequences, mother-son incest, confronting a prejudice. These are all, by the way, by reputable professional journals, including the Journal of the American Medical Association, VA Contazarite and S.A. Coombs have an essay, 1980, mother-son incest, maternal sexual abuse of males, in another journal, on and on and on. So it is it's documented. It's not something that I'm just making up or projecting, quote unquote, into this Hodel scenario. I think it was very real for all the different reasons and more that I didn't have time to get to, that I think that Dr. George, what became Dr. George H., standing for Hill, Hodel Jr., was a victim of mother-son incest. Okay, now let me skip very quickly to, this is another area where I think Steve Hodel does not really go into. He has his own particular areas of expertise as well as interest. He misses the fact, I think, that George Hodel was part of a larger, he might have been the supervisor, he might have been dreaming these up as art projects. I agree with Steve Hodel in that. They were like little masterpieces, sick masterpieces by Dr. George Hodel. But he was masterminding. He was writing out these scenarios that other people were executing. They were delivering. And I think these were these super soldier types. These people, you've seen the Max Spears videos, those people who were trained at a young age, just like Dr. George himself at an early stage, was trained to execute these types of maneuvers. And we have more and more information that's coming out all the time. And that's those two books I referred to you, like the one by Robert Duncan, Soul Catcher, Project Soul Catcher, that will fill in the blanks that the YouTubers have been filling up with their repetition and their echo chamber. And people like Annie Jacobson have been sucking oxygen out of the current research that's the real McCoy in 2021, people like Robert Duncan. That's why they put together the synthetic author called Annie Jacobson. That's why they put together a synthetic author named McGowan to defame the counterculture of the 1960s. I'm mentioning this because these people ostensibly are bringing light to this world. Ostensibly, they're on our side. And yeah, they are. I can benefit by their work, but I'm saying they are limited. They are maybe limited hangouts. They're projects to get ahead of the real cutting edge research material that has been produced by Robert Duncan. And even we have to look beyond him himself, because if you read his credentials, his bona fides, he comes out of this world himself. So maybe that itself is a limited hangout, right? So what Dr. George Hodel was doing, he was a supervisor of mind hacked operatives, the people who were the graduates or trainees within this project Soul Catcher. Let me go, since we've only got 5 minutes. Let me go into some of the, and I'll put this excerpt here on for the Patreon people in case you don't want to buy the book. You'll at least have the outline of the book in the form of a table of contents. But just to give you an idea of where Robert Duncan is taking this, and I think Hodel research and all the research of weird occurrences like the smiley face killers, right, that's going on right now, can be explained by looking at this literature. This is not the end all and be all by Robert Duncan, but it's I think a really productive source of new research threads that we can benefit by, and I encourage you all to do that. So here's the introduction, chapter 1, hacking computer and biological systems. When I read this this book 7, 8 years ago, I think, yeah, I think it's about 8 years ago. I think when it first came out, I was on it. We now see that our own biology, our genome has been hacked, right? We're seeing through these, let me use that term. It starts with a small m and it ends with a capital A. We see that being inserted into our system. So it's not so bizarre of a assumption here. Worms, mimetic viruses, psychotronic virus. By the way, Peter Thiel is very much into this notion of the mimesis, which he got from some European import. René Girard over at Stanford, the literature department, mimetic viruses, right? That's part of the current assault on us. So he goes into that. It's going much further than your Annie Jacobson. The hacking of belief systems. Yeah, we know a lot about that. The pleasure pain principles, the grooming, sexual humiliation, whether it's experienced by Perry Hilton or a young George Hodel Jr. Self-destruct algorithms, counter-espionage. Some of this stuff is more well-known to us, right? It builds on previous research. He talks about scripts, about the Alice in Wonderland script, the Wizard of Oz script, Angels and Demons script, all the popular culture script. Maybe it's the Simple Life script that Perry Hilton introduced to a new generation of girls. Chapter 3, designing demigods, active NSA, CIA, DoD systems. Mentally integrated neuron duplicator, chatterboxes, silent assassination techniques. Some of you know this material here. In concluding chapter, the politics, laws, and ethics of neurological weapons, right? And different appendices. So that gives you an idea of the state of art circa 2010. I'm sure it's much further and more extensive than that. Suffice to say that if you're just watching YouTube and listening to so-called independent media or listening to podcasts on iTunes or wherever it is, most of it's going to be dated, and most of it's going to be diversionary, and most of it's going to lead you into just a dead end, a cul-de-sac. We're exactly the type of situation that we were led on January 6th. It was a holding pen. It was a slaughter zone. In this case, they're slaughtering any sort of critical consciousness and awareness. So it's up to us to keep pushing those frontiers forward and going into distasteful areas of investigation, including, as I mentioned already, mother and son incest. So that we can recognize the games, the ops that are being the projects, the operations that are being put on us, so we can forestall them, so we can circumvent them, and we can come up with counter strategies to them. And there are counter strategies. Most of them depend upon our own individual initiative and strength. Perry Hilton was not able to reconcile the trauma to which he was exposed multiple times through these so-called social learning camps, re-education camps, really. She was not able to get through it, except for the fact of her own intelligence, her own self-scrutiny, and her own ability to bond with other people in similar situations so that they can compare notes and together come up with a counteroffensive. And the one that they have arrived at today is very effective. They have done a documentary holding up just hand-lettered cards about their one particular school in particular, then specific rather, that they went to, and saying, close it down. This is what it's up to. This is what it's done to us, right? Very effective, very low tech, very simple. It didn't even require a cell phone or selfies. And she puts a piece of tape over her mouth to signify the silence that was imposed on her by threatening her parents, exposure, humiliation, lies, whatever it is that they entrapped her into. So that's just one example of how we ourselves, if we are in a similar situation, we can talk about our places of work or other places, other institutions that we know of. It could be a sports camp. It could be the Boy Scouts. It could be the girl, whatever it is. We can present this information to a larger public to warn others from falling into this trap. And I predict that this whole network, this troubled teen industry, is going to come in for a profound reevaluation, and it might even go out entirely. It'll resurface in other forms, right? Just as we see evil resurfacing in different manifestations. They're very clever about this. But for now, the troubled teen industry is exposed. The mental health industry mafia is being exposed. It's going to fall. It's going to fall. And how do I know this? Because there was a film, I think it came out in 57, 58. It was called Borstal Boy. Borstal is the system that used to be in place, Victorian, very harsh and Dickensian almost type of harsh, brutal reform school. We call juvenile hall, juvie, we'd call them today. Or today they call them social learning places. In the old days, we call them juvie. Paris Hilton is privileged, so they can't call it juvenile hall. But anyway, this filmmaker, was it Lindsay Anderson? Can't remember. He also did The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. You'll figure it out. I saw his whole oeuvre. This is the 50s, but he came up through this documentary, Borstal Boy. And that film, it's nonfiction. It's a narrative film. It's not a documentary. I take it back. It was a narrative film, right? And it caught the public imagination to such a degree that the Borstal system, within a couple of years, there were inquiries, official inquiries, government inquiries, institutional inquiries, police inquiries, I think. And that whole system went out. Now, have they replaced it with something else? Probably, yes. But I'm just saying that certain types of strategies that can be enacted through film, through literature, for the very techniques, using the same tools that they use against us, can be turned around and used for tools of education, liberation, so that we can recover our humanity. We are one of the most oppressive, most comprehensive forms of communication. We're on it right now. We're doing this, but we're at the same time, we're able to use that tool, that mechanism, to bring light to this horrendous problem that was manifested in young George Hodel, and we're seeing it manifested in more recent times through the person of Paris Hilton. I'm pronouncing her name correctly as we conclude here instead of Perry Hilton. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate your attention. Please share this presentation far and wide. As you know, I'm on a different channel, so some people might have got lost in the shuffle. This information is important for everybody because we're in a Borstal situation. We're starting to come out of it, thanks to people like you and others who have finally come to the forefront and said, "No, we're holding up the sign. We're going to put the tape on. We're making a statement. No more, no more. It's over." So thank you again. We'll see you next Thursday for another scintillating, exciting, and original live stream. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you then. Bye.